Johnson. Let's give it up. autonomy, which we say is the only thing that states can gain some sort of actual moral agency from, is that we have to have democracy.
Why do states have to have moral agency in the first place? That seems to not be there.
Seems like states have to have a reason to act.
Okay, so all your framework does in the first point then is say that states need a reason to act.
Sure, and I argue then that that reason to act has to come
It's
from
aggregation,
Sure.
right? Why is it aggregation?
Because the only way that we can actually effectively figure out what like a group of people want, or what a group of people would require.
Why can't it be non-interference? Why does it have to be a positive obligation to go out and pull the people? Why can't it just be an obligation to ensure that they're not hurting each other, or that the state's not doing things to hurt them?
That seems to provide, at best, only sometimes, like action. Sometimes if states have to choose between two actions, then they can't choose that by just saying that we shouldn't stop, or we shouldn't hurt people, or stop people from doing what they want to do.
Okay. I'm wondering about the link between democracy and morality in general. Why is democracy a moral system? I don't know of any ethics authors who say democracy is morality.
I mean, I'm not arguing that democracy is like a moral system so much as a way to determine.
Well, because I thought your value was morality.
Yeah. So I'm saying the only way to determine.
Don't you define morality as like verbatim conformity to right human conduct? So don't you have to prove that democracy is in some way right human conduct, not right government conduct?
Sure. So there's a lot of people in the country, and the only way for us to determine how everyone should behave in the country, when it comes to governments acting, which the resolution requires that governments act, is to aggregate those ethical concerns.
Okay, that just seems like it's another assertion. But I'm wondering, what about morality is inherently moral? Like, what about morality what about democracy ensures that freedom, as you say, is protected, rather than just making it so that I would have like 10,000 people telling me what to do with my freedom?
So the idea is that if everyone has input, then that gives everyone.
But does my voice really count if I'm in the minority on an issue?
Sure. There's no reason to say that democracy wouldn't also protect minorities.
And is your contention that we have to do whatever it takes to increase participation? What's the bright line on the standard?
Yeah, the standard is increased democratic participation. I don't think that.
So anything that governments do to increase participation is a moral action under the affirmative standard.
Sure.
Okay, so if I lock people up in boxes on election day, give them no food and water, and tell them to vote, that is a moral action under the affirmative standard.
That doesn't seem.
So slavery is a moral action under the affirmative standard.
Hard.
I would like to know why.
Okay.
I'll start my question.
Yeah, so like the idea of a democratic choice requires people to be able to exercise autonomy. That's the Levin-Waldman 1 card. So if you do something to deny autonomy in trying to achieve autonomy, that would be nonsensical.
Anything that denies autonomy to achieve autonomy is not a moral action, even if it does not increase participation.
Totally.
Okay, so the framework is about what? Right? It's talked about a lot in CS. Who wants to tell me what the value criterion? Who wants to tell me what the value criterion was? Yeah. In the back.
Okay, the value was morality.
Right.
The criterion was increasing civic participation.
Right. So increasing the participation people have in the democratic framework. And how many ones were there for the value criterion? Yeah. Two. Who knows what the first one was? Yep.
Well, it says that states can combine and act as one agent, but individuals can't combine and
Right, so here's this example, right? If Germany, the UK, and Great Britain were all suddenly like, we're going to form the United States of Europe and cease to be three separate countries and became one country, there are now two less countries in the world, right? But that doesn't seem like a big deal, right? But if there were once three people and then one person, that means like two people have died, and that would be a big deal. So it seems as though the moral autonomy of a state is a very different sort of thing from the moral autonomy of individuals, right? We can combine states, right, without anyone dying. We can't like combine two humans together without, frankly, both of them dying, right? Like, slingshot two individuals, right? They're not going to last or end well, right? And so it seems as though the state is a very different sort of entity. Does that make sense? And therefore, it only gets its moral autonomy from the moral agents that comprise it, because that's the only place the moral autonomy can come from. It can't be in itself. Otherwise, it would be bad if like a state died. But we don't normally think that if it became replaced with a new state. What is the second one for the standard? Yeah.
The democracy doesn't recognize the difference between the individuals.
Right. Why other people, right? When they're the rulers and the ruled. Democracy, though, says everyone can act as ruler if they're engaged in sort of participation, and they will preserve that equality. Does that make sense? They are both ruler and ruled, and so no one becomes disadvantaged under, say, like a tyrannical system. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. So, if you were to guess, what do you think the negatives are going to disagree with in this framework, based on the CX strategy? Yeah.
He's going to disagree that democracy is not necessarily a moral government.
Good, right? So likely the negative is not going to say democracy is immoral, but say that democracy is not enough for morality, right? What might have clued us into that strategy from CX? Yeah. Yep.
Just gonna run Novik because
Who?
Novik.
Nozick?
Nozick, my bad, sorry.
No worries.
So just gonna run Nozick because she asked about the police force in the army, and what she's probably going to say is something along the lines of it's not moral for our government to interfere, but they should have extreme respect for people's rights.
Yeah, so likely, right, it looks like the negative is going to make some arguments about how people have to have certain rights, right? What concession did she get towards the end of CX there, as per that NC? Yeah.
Anything to increase participation is justified, or is moral?
Well, what did she then establish afterwards, right? What was it agreed to? What is not justified to increase participation?
It's called violation of human rights.
Right, so we can't violate autonomy in order to increase democracy, right? So, if we're right in thinking that she'd likely make arguments about human rights, that's probably going to matter a lot in this debate.
That highlight. Is everyone ready? Because I'ma be rich, I'm engaged. I value morality because optimism is moral obligation. Moral codes are meant to guide action. But any moral theory that does not rely on reason is capable and would fail to obligate us, since we can always question why we ought to follow it. I can say that we ought to obey laws, or why should I act on that, but the question of why I should act on reasons concedes the authority of reason, since I ask for a reason for the reason. Thus, the only authoritative moral theory is one that is based upon reason. In order to create rules that apply to everyone, reasons must be subject to neutral and apply to all. Subjective universalizability requires respect for individual independence, where independence is the ability of a person to pursue their own ends while being consistent with others' freedoms to set their own ends. Violating independence cannot be universalizable, since if an agent violates independence of another, they are willing simultaneously that they can violate independence, but that their independence ought to be respected. This is non-universalizable as a maxim, since I am willing to contradictory aims. Moreover, universalizing the maxim of violating independence undermines moral systems, since having maxims that permits violations of other also universalizes permission to violate moral rules, rendering moral constraints meaningless. So the standard is consistency with individual independence. Individual independence is a precondition to the affirmative standard, because if one is not independent, then one cannot participate in a democratic decision-making. He concedes this flat out in CX. I contend that governments obligating employers to pay a living wage is inconsistent with individual independence. Just governments must not force anyone to pay higher wages than they choose, even if voluntarily providing a certain wage is desirable. First, obligations reliant on distributive justice violate the the independence of one person as more valuable. But a just government would not do this because all people are bound by the same agreement. This turns the AC again because democracy cannot compel employers to become mere tools to the end of their employees. Go to the top of the AC. First, notice that under the value of morality, he talks about how it is conformity to right human conduct. When he says that, what he's saying is that governments are actually agents that act on behalf of humans, but their obligations cannot conflict with the obligations of individuals. I say individuals cannot violate the independence of another individual. Government, you can't incorporate and become a government of multiple people to skirt that moral obligation and still call yourself moral. So mine is a side constraint clearly to the affirmative framework. Second, he said that, remember that at the end of CS, he agrees that he cannot do anything to promote participation if it interferes with independence. That means that the negative case is a side constraint again on the affirmative case. He has to deal with those arguments before he can ever access any of the impacts that are coming out of the top of the AC. Secondly, my argument is that this notion of democracy that he furthers is actually one that allows people to be enslaved for others' ends. I'm saying that democracy means that you don't have one master, you have 10,000 masters. The point is, my one vote isn't going to do enough to change that. What we really need to do is we need to have governments that have an obligation of non-interference, and the only way to do that is to look to universalizable reasons that the affirmative case or the negative case gives you. On this first justification that states do not produce agency in the same way people do, I've already addressed that at the very top, so you can cross-apply my argument about how states should act. On the second one, that moral systems must have fundamental equality, I think the negative framework is very clearly co-opting this link and telling you why that equality means that you cannot interfere in individuals' lives in terms of positive obligations. On the contention one that it's going to improve their self-worth, Levin and Walden, too, I don't really care about. He says that people are going to have like a much better view of their lives. I'm going to prove later on in the case that that view is going to be decreasing over time because their lives are actually going to get worse. Let's prove that now on the subpoint B. The affirmative case is actually incorrectly identifies that low wage is the source for poverty. Talia et al. Explains, the impact of employment for reducing poverty was studied using analysis of poverty rates in Chicago. The poverty rate was compared to the employment rate. 3/4 of the difference in community poverty rates is due to lack of employment, not low wages. Each 1% reduction in employment led to a 1.3 increase in poverty. This is the terminal defense to the AC because increasing wages does very little, if anything, to address the root cause of poverty, as most poor families will not be positively impacted by the change in wages. Second, living wage actually is going to increase poverty. There are several terms. A, increased wages increased wages bump people up into a higher tax bracket and decrease the amount of government benefits they qualify for. His lip analysis and the contention to concede this, I'm saying that increased price they pay to the government is really a benefit to the government, but not to the people. B, living wage laws increase outsourcing because companies can only afford to pay so much for unskilled labor. Jobs that would have previously been inhabited by citizens are likely to move overseas, making fewer jobs and fewer opportunities domestically. C, living wage laws increase incentives for employers to invest in technology such as self-checkout machines for unskilled labor. Technology is costly, but the cost is offset by having to pay more than market requires for employees, thus there are fewer jobs and potentially more layoffs. D, employers will change their hiring preferences towards more skilled labor because they want to get the most for their money. Those with the least education and experience are priced out of the market. Those are the people that John is talking about, so he's actually hurting them more. On the second contention, he talks about income inequality. I'd say, first of all, it is not true that he's affecting only the least well off. This situation is one that there are people who are part of rich families who work poor jobs. He doesn't do a good job of distinguishing between those, so he's actually increasing the gap because he's giving a living wage to people who actually don't need it. Additionally, when he's increasing poverty through the terms, that's not going to result in a less gap.
Negative framework. So the justification for why we have to allow people to set their own end for individual independence, right? What is that justification? Right above
standards that are universalizable to all.
Okay, so everyone has to have their own ability to choose, though, right? That is the implication you draw from this, right?
No, not at all. I'm not saying that they have to be free to choose and that like they need to go to the polls and vote for someone. I'm saying that there is an obligation towards non-interference because if I say that I am independent for you and you say, no, let me use that independence to justify my own independence, then I'm actually dependent, not independent.
Okay, so if I can prove that people are unable to set their own ends in your world,
Doesn't matter.
doesn't matter. So
Well, I mean, like if they can't set their own ends because they're poor, what I'm saying is that the government does not have an obligation to make people rich.
wait, so
Because when you make people rich, you say, I'm enslaved so that you can be richer. I have no, like there's never a right of the government to enslave you.
okay, cool. So let's move down to contention one. What is the argument for that contention? What is the impact?
I mean, the impact is pretty clear. The impact of the first contention is that you will, in inconsistent actions, because you say that people are both independent and dependent at the same time. The secondary impact is that you allow slaves to enslave or you allow governments to enslave employers, and that action in and of itself is immoral.
Right. So who is enslaved in this situation? Like who is the
Whoever
person?
is paying a wage that is not the wage that they wish to pay.
Right. So my question is, does Nozick recognize does a business have the same rights that Nozic's world that people have?
I think that businesses are owned by people, and generally that people are the ones who are cutting the paycheck, so I'm not sure that that argument matters.
Okay, so the argument is just that because because owners cut paychecks, they're automatically enslaved. They have to pay different wages.
Yeah, the market sets the price, John. The price is one that you are saying is not high enough, that it needs to be increased. I'm saying that the interference of the government in that process is a form of slavery.
So anytime the government has control over the process of setting prices, that's a problem. It knows it's world, correct?
Well, in my world, I advocate for that the free market solves that.
Okay, awesome. So if I can prove that governments, or that there is no economy free of government control,
Then that. It still does not mean that the action is moral. It might mean that the action needs to be feasible. I'm saying that the only way to have a moral action is to have one where the wills do not contradict. So you're still going to have to deal with that analysis.
okay, awesome.
Okay, so who can tell me what the criterion was in Mrs. Nealon's framework? Emma. Yes, can anyone explain what that means? It's kind of a complicated framework, but a very good one. Yeah, here's that hand.
That you can't force, so you can't say that one person has independence, but then the next person has to give up some of their rights in order to make sure the other person has their independence.
Right, so being independent means being able to pursue your own ends without hurting other people's ends.
Yeah, so what that indicates is that morality has a certain structure almost. What it means to have a proper moral obligation is to have an obligation that can apply to everyone universally. Because only that can be consistent with it applying to all humans, as all of us being rational agents of the source of morality. You remember that the AC framework said humans have to be the source of morality, even at the state. And so this is saying if that's true, it means we can't be inconsistent. We can't say, I need to take away your property and then give it to someone else. Because in doing so, essentially the logic of that is, your property is not yours, but that would seem to indicate that property itself is not the thing that we originally thought it was. If you want to give it to someone else, it's just contradictory. I'm saying, you get more property, this other person gets less. But that is contradictory under the framework, which says we have to maximize everyone's ability, or be consistent with everyone's ability to have this sort of independence. Does that make sense, people?
So she did something really cool in her framework. She already started to compare her framework to John's framework in her case before she even got to her speech of answering his framework. Does anybody know what I'm talking about, where she mentioned John's framework and hers to start comparing? Yeah?
When she talked about living wage is basically independent, she talks about autonomy.
Sure, I think she did that in the contention, but does anyone know, under the criterion, she said that her standard is a precondition to the affirmative standard. Did anybody get that, or could you explain what she means by that? already starting that comparison for the next speech so that she's ready to compare frameworks and not just try to indict his, which is what we were talking about before.
Alright. Let's say you were the ad in this round. What sort of arguments do you think you might want to make to get ready for this 1AR? What might be some ways that you could compare your frameworks in a way that would point out maybe some deficiencies in the negative and why yours might be preferable? Any ideas? Is that a hand? Yeah. Any ideas?
Do you guys still have questions about what her framework is saying?
So her framework establishes I have to have a complete right over my independence. Does her framework ever establish why property is something that's part of my independence? Why the money I own is crucial to my independence? What do you guys think? Right, so she certainly says that independence is important, but doesn't contextualize as much what that independence is. What might that allow John to do as a reason why his framework is preferable? What sort of comparison could that enable, potentially? What does the government do? What does it legitimate? What does it create? It creates laws, right? And what do those laws define? Right? And in particular, right, it seems as though government laws are what carve out my ability to own property, right? If I give something to you, right, if I sign over my house, I have to do so in accordance with the law. I have to sign some sheet of paper. I have to get it approved. I have to, get the government's approval on a particular type, right? I can't just be like, oh yeah, you can have this house, right? I have to follow through for the government to legitimate certain property transfers, right? So it seems that the government plays a crucial role in making sense of institutions like property. It seems that in order to have property, we first have to have a community that grounds these sort of ideas, right? So perhaps democracy is important to our ability to have that sort of system. Does that make sense, people? How that might work? How our independence might only come from a free government in the first place, or a equal system in the first place, or a society that can ground it in the first place? Cool. So that might be one, way that you could start engaging in this comparison. Let's say that John were to win the framework debate. Would that just mean Mrs. Meelan is, done for? No, why not? Yeah. That's true. Let's even say she loses her contention. Then is it over?
What types of answers did she make on the affirmative case? Turns. She made a lot of really good turns. What were some of the turns that she made? There are some really good arguments there that I'm glad we heard.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yep. What was another one? Yeah? That's a good one too. Over there?
Living wages will make the companies use robots and stuff.
Yeah.
Employers will change their viewpoints so they only hire the skilled workers instead of the low-wage ones, like people in poverty.
Yeah, so how does she tie all of these turns into John's argument about how people will feel better about themselves when they have more money? Kaylee?
Well, I think the turning into one big turning by saying that it doesn't account for these ones.
Yeah, she used those terms to explain that over a period of time, people are going to realize they're not really feeling better just because they're getting paid living wages, because all of these other bad things are going to happen that we're explaining the terms. Okay.
Let's see what happens. Is everyone good? Okay. Oh, it's gonna be instigate. Everyone ready? Cool. Let's start out with Mrs. Meelan's framework. Mrs. Meelan gives us a couple of arguments that tell us why we have to preserve individual freedom. But the first problem with this is that she does not tell us what things count under freedom. She tells us people have to set their own ends, but she doesn't tell us why people have to necessarily have complete control over their property to do this. This is a missing link in the framework that she is just not explaining. This means that even if I'm losing everything else, she's not explaining why property rights are crucial to Nozick's framework, so it doesn't mean that necessarily we
on certain kinds of coercion or injustice, we have to accept that redistribution might be necessary. Nozick writes, there is no argument based on the first two principles for distributive justice for such a more extensive state. If the set of holdings is properly generated, there is no argument for a more extensive state. If, however, these principles are violated, the principle of rectification comes into play. Assuming that those from the least well-off group in society have the highest possibilities of being the descendants of victims of the most serious injustice, then a rough rule of thumb for rectifying injustice might organize society so as to maximize the position of whatever group ends up least well-off in the society. But an important question for each society will be the following. Given its particular history, past injustices might be so great as to make necessary in the short run a more extensive state in order to rectify them. This becomes incredibly important for the negative because there are plenty of instances of past injustices in almost every government that require that we redistribute wealth in some ways, i.e. discrimination and things like that. These force governments to be willing to redistribute wealth and allow people to make more money even if it necessarily doesn't respect what your employers want to pay. So, this is a couple of problems with Mrs. Nealon's framework. So let's go down to the contention level. The biggest problem with the contention level is that it doesn't function under any other framework. So if either one of the arguments against the Nozickian framework at the top take out that framework, there's no reason why liberty or violations of people's external independence necessarily link to my framework. So that means you don't buy, there's no offense coming off that as long as you buy at least one of the arguments at the top of the case. So let's go over to the act. At the top on the framework, Mrs. Nealon says that equality means that we can't interfere, so she's trying to go off the internal link out of the second justification for democracy. The problem is that people aren't equal in her world. I'm already giving you plenty of reasons why at the bottom of the app people don't have the ability to set their own ends as it comes out right now. Even in a democracy, people don't have the ability to set their own ends because if they don't have a sufficient income, they don't have any way to participate in that democracy. And what I'm telling you is that there's no other way for participate or for people to set their own ends other than any democracy. So that's a couple of problems. Let me clarify that real quick. My argument is that democracies allow people to set their own ends. That means that at a minimum, democracies are prerequisites to this Nozick argument. Sorry, that probably should have been on the instant framework. I'm getting a little unclear here. But the problem is that I'm telling you that in Ms. Nealon's world, there's no way for people to achieve equality, so there's no way for people to set their own ends. Just a real quick, and also real quick on the first justification for democracy, Ms. Nealon just says that states have to act the same way as people do, but I'm already giving you a couple of reasons over on her side of the flow as to why people aren't necessarily constrained by the Nozickian framework either. So we can clearly see that you should extend the first argument because states have to gain their obligations from individuals. Individuals have an obligation to participate in democracy. Then on the second argument, you should extend it because we have to respect the equality of individuals and respect their ability to set their own ends. So let's go down to the contention level debate. The biggest part of this debate is just that if I can prove that living wages don't lead to unemployment, then all of Ms. Nealon's terms go away. So Allegretto and Pitts prove minimum wage increases can lift families out of poverty, provide a counterweight against growing economic and gender-based inequalities. Path-breaking research in 1994 found no evidence that the increase in the minimum wage in New Jersey reduced employment differently than what occurred in neighboring Pennsylvania. So we can see that there are plenty of different empirical research to back this up. The only argument she's giving is from Tully. That's just one city. I'm giving you multiple different states, and I'm giving you Baltimore, and I don't have time. So, vote determined.
Okay, so who can explain the first response that John made on Mr. Nealon's framework? We had a couple good responses, yeah?
That's the property rights more complaint.
Right. She said that she is missing the big link in her framework, as Marcia talked about before. What was the second response? Yeah?
That she's assuming the perfect world where everyone's going to have the exact limit of minutes, but in a real world situation, there's always going to be some sort of people being slighted, so he's trying to maximize the least amount of people being slighted, so there still is mostly equality.
Yeah, good. And what was really interesting about, like, which author did he use? Yeah?
You use the author as a sort of her case for a lot of times.
Yeah, he used Yeah, he used Nozick, which is the author that Ms. Nealon was using in her case, which is a really cool strategy because John could argue that her own author is saying the opposite, that we need to have some sort of redistribution and not complete independent property rights. So you can see the good framework comparison going on when he answers her framework. So let's talk about the debate on the AC now. What did John try to do with all of the responses that she made to the contention? How did he respond to all those terms? Is that hand? about that strategy to group all those terms with just one word response. Yeah?
Strategic when you have limited time.
What?
It's strategic when you have limited time.
It's going to be running out of time, yeah. What do you guys think that Mrs. Nealon will do in her next speech with some of those terms? Do you think she'll extend them? What are you, do you think that it'll be easy for her to extend some of them, or just super hard?
Yeah.
She'll have to try to disprove his claim on unemployment.
Maybe. Does she have any terms that aren't dependent on unemployment?
Yeah.
Which ones?
Outsourcing.
Outsourcing would say we're going to put the jobs elsewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Her first turn, she's talking about increases taxes and decreases government benefits.
Good, right? An increase in tax and decrease in government benefits has nothing to do with unemployment. Does she have any other offense that doesn't have to do with? Yep.
She said that it's also affecting the rich who actually work low-wage jobs, so it's in fact increasing the rich workers.
Yep. It's going to decrease equality because, it's going to be like, college-age students who have rich parents who are getting the money. Yeah.
How about connected to skilled workers, employees won't hire skilled workers, there's still employment, but it's just the wrong people are being employed.
Exactly, right? So here are three pretty significant terms that don't seem to rely on unemployment. Does that make sense? Does everyone see how that could be a problem for John? You got this pretty solid two-way R. This is incidentally a reason why it's often not very strategic to take the strategy John took here, which is to go NCAC. Because what you often end up happening, you spend a lot of time to win the framework debate, and you don't actually have all that much time to clearly win the contention debate. Often it's better if you only have one piece of offense to start with that offense. That's something you have to win no matter what else happens. And then get to everything else later on, which is less crucial. People understand that? Cool. Yep.
I'm going to begin with an overview, and then we're going to talk about the affirmative contention level. We'll then talk about the framework, and we'll finish up with the negative case. Everyone got that? As an overview, this round is very clearly a negative ballot for two reasons. First of all, I'm going to prove to you that John does nothing to help out people who are in lower socioeconomic positions, and thus does nothing to make them feel better or to increase the likelihood that they get out to the polls. If that's true, he has no link back to his criterion, and that's the only piece of offense that he potentially has in the round. The second thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to prove to you through the framework debate that I am, one, winning the framework, and second, that government should have an obligation to not interfere with people, and that independence is the most important criteria. When I do that, I will then extend the negative case and prove to you that a living wage is actually going to violate the notions of morality that both John and I value. To the first point, if you will go down to the affirmative contention level, John reads a piece of evidence that talks about how there was no evidence in this one empirical study that proved that there was increased unemployment as a result of a living wage. This is problematic because it does not address all of my terms. First, if you'll extend my first terms, that increased wages mean that it's really just a trick that the government plays in order to increase taxes and get more revenue, not a benefit to the people. What this means is that even though people are earning more, they're not going to have any more disposable income that John is talking about because they're just going to give it all to the government. It also means that they're going to be less able to get the kinds of social programs that the government provides that are currently helping to subsidize their wages. Second, if you'll jump down to my fourth term, the D subpoint, which says that employers will change their hiring preferences towards more skilled labor because they want to get the most for their money. Those with the least education and experience will be effectively priced out of the market, which will increase the cycle of poverty. This term effectively means that even if there's more employment, or if the cost of employment is negligible, as the Pitt argument might indicate, that it doesn't matter because the people who need the jobs aren't going to be able to have the jobs in the first place. Third, extra income who are going to get the money. So it's not necessarily going to be the people who need it. All of these terms serve to show you that even if there is a link between democracy and morality, that he is not increasing the kind of turnout that he talks about through his framework. Additionally, jump up to that framework. John does a lot of things on the framework debate, but not a lot of them are actually responsive to what I'm saying. If you extend my first argument that that you can't incorporate to get rid of your moral obligations, he says that governments have a different source of moral obligations. I'm questioning that very link. I'm saying, why didn't we do things that are different from what humans are obligated to do? He's not answering that question. He says that Nozick says that we can do this, but the Nozick card really does not speak to this point because it does not speak to the locus of a moral obligation. He just says that it might be just to redistribute income at some point, but not the locus of a moral obligation. Then he says that we have to respect everyone's ends. I think that I'm proving better through my framework, which he's not addressing the internal horns on, that respecting independence is the only way to have a universal maxim, which means it's the only link to being able to set your own ends. He's saying that if you're in poverty, you can't set your own ends. What I'm saying is I didn't cause your poverty. So I don't know why that means that I have an obligation to solve for it. And I certainly don't know why it means that governments have an obligation to then require me to work for you. The last thing that he says is that people are not equal in my world. This is against the final framework argument where I tell you that I'm hijacking the link. He says that people are not equal in my world, that there's no ability for them to set their own ends, and that democracy is the only way that does this. What I told you in the last speech was that democracy does not in fact do this. It means that you have not just one master, you have 10,000 masters, that your voice does not necessarily reflect that you are going to get the kind of social change that you need in your life. Since you're not benefited by it, the government cannot force you to do it. That point will be further explicated when we go on to the negative case, so go there now. Against my framework, he makes two responses. The first one is that I don't tell you that property right is part of freedom. I don't tell you that on the framework arguments. I'm not really sure why I have to. The first Nozick card seems to indicate why what you do with your time is part of your independence, what you choose to do with your time. And since when you choose to earn money with your time, that is additionally part of your independence, so money would thus be part of your independence. That syllogism is pretty clear. It's just not proven on the framework debate. Second, he says, he reads this Nozick card that talks about inequalities and helping the least well off. But what it specifically says is that we're talking about places with past injustices. My argument would be that a just government is one that does not have these injustices, and certainly they have not been redressed. So you can extend the syllogism of the framework. I value morality. I tell you that moral codes must be based on reasons, and those reasons must be universal, because otherwise you'd be willing contradictory things. You cannot say that in order to justify your independence, you have to make me dependent. That does not make any sense. So the criterion is consistency with individual independence. You can then extend the first Nozick card out of the contention. I tell you that distributive justice effectively enslaves those who are working for an amount that they it enslaves the employers who must pay more than the market sets for the labor price. He says that this doesn't function under any of his standards. That doesn't matter because remember, my framework is a side constraint to his framework, and he has not answered that. So this is a clear link to my framework, which means that you can't even look to the affirmative framework. The second Nozick card you can also extend. That one talks about how specifically you cannot use one to a means to an end. That's where I gained the link about how it's a contradictory maxim, because what he says is that you are saying that I am free, but you are requiring me in my freedom or independence to do things for another person, and that governments specifically do not have that obligation because they are supposed to protect everyone, not just some.
Alright, so there were a number of arguments going for in the debate. Interesting enough, you guys were actually able to figure out a lot of what the strategies are going to be just from the conversation we had ahead of time. Yeah. Excellent. You guys are flowing well. That or Jen just copy, Ms. Beals just copying your ideas. One of the two.
Yeah, I mean it.
Not easy to tell sometimes. But let's talk about what happened in this debate. Okay? So this first stuff we were talking about, by going through the terms of the contention, which shows can be precluded by the answer for unemployment. But then, Mrs. Nealon makes a number of arguments about how her framework acts as a side constraint, right? This is coming out of the NC. Anyone can tell me what a side constraint means in this context? Yeah.
It constrains what you're trying to do, so it's the software for the board.
Sure. It constrains what you're trying to do. So it says, yeah, this might be a good thing, but there's certain things you can't do in pursuit of that good thing, right? So this might be something that's a great end, right? People participate in democracy is a really good thing, right? Ms. Nealon never says it's not a good thing. But her argument is that even if given up in boxes to force them to vote on election day, right? So there have to be restrictions on what I can do to get people to participate in government. And one of those things is respecting their independence and autonomy, which is manifest through property, my choice of how to spend my time. Make sense? So, it doesn't matter how great this is if there's something that you can't do in order to achieve it. That's the analysis coming out of the end of the speech. What do people think about the framework debate? Who do you think is ahead on it? Someone tell me. Yeah.
I think it's
Why is that?
because it just seems like our arguments for the framework are actually stronger and go more into how John can fulfill the resolution and it no longer be discovered.
Okay, which argument in particular do you think is stronger?
Out of the framework,
Yeah.
I think he wanted to ask how the kind of ideological argument that for the students that kind of goes for those.
Why do you think, which of the arguments in Mrs. Meelan's case, where change people's means to an end, do you think is strongest? Come back to you. Anyone able to think they can give me the argument they find strongest in Mrs. Meelan's case? Yeah.
If I am independent, I should have to give up my independence to help you. I didn't, like, for instance, she's like made the reference to poverty. I didn't put you in poverty. Why should it be my responsibility to get you out of poverty?
Good. That's important, right? If I did not put you there, right, if it's not my fault in some way, if there's not some justification for you unfairly in there that has to do with me, right, then you should not be, then I should not be obligated to help you. Is there anything that John might be able to do to interact with that sort of analysis? We'll find out. Cool. Everyone set? It's going to go in C8. Good. Off Mrs. Meelan's framework, the first argument that she says is that Nozick creates this syllogism for what it means for why property is part of your independence. But again, this is not part of the, first of all, she is not making this implication in the NC. This is a brand new argument about how people are automatically owed whatever they spend their time on. But this just doesn't make any sense, especially since she's not telling you why necessarily just spending our time on something means that we own it. Or it means that we own it. So like things like wages don't necessarily matter or don't necessarily count as part of our independence. Now, go to the second argument. Mrs. Meelan says that past injustices just don't exist in a just government. This is something that is not defined until the 2N, and is not and even then the argument is not sufficient. What I'm telling you is that Nozick says that in a society where the world was set up imperfect in the first place, where we have an imperfect society where there are past injustices, and that justifies some sort of rectification policy, and that means that we do have the ability, and like I said, and like even Nozick says, the fact that these injustices create specific economic problems for people that are often passed down means that we have an ability to rectify this with redistributive policies. So, like I said, this is two different reasons why maybe redistributing wealth doesn't violate, or more than likely that redistributing wealth doesn't violate Ms. Meelan's framework. This means that as long as I can prove, this means that the contention offense goes away, because Ms. Meelan's argument is just that that I am redistributing wealth, but if I'm proving that doesn't violate any framework, then that's a pretty easy way for you to not, or that's a pretty terrible way for you both around. So, let's go to the AC now. The top of the AC, Ms. Meelan's argument, first off, is that states act the same way that individuals do. But like I told you, but like I keep telling you, because I'm proving that individuals might have a share, but there might be a reason why individuals can redistribute in Nozick's world, i.e. things like past injustices, or the fact that people can't set their own ends, then that means that states have the ability to too. The first argument is just defense. Now, let's go to the second argument, where she says that equality means that we can't interfere. What I'm telling you is that equality doesn't exist in the first place. People don't have the ability to set their ends in our world unless we do unless we redistribute in some way. There is an income inequality. This does exist. People can't participate. That's a problem. So, this means that we have the ability to redistribute. Again, extend the second justification that equality of individuals is only recognized in a democratic society. This means that people have to be able to participate in order to set their own ends. This means that you automatically prefer a framework of democracy. Now let's get on to contention. Ms. Meelan's argument is that all these other terms are independent of unemployment. What I'm telling you is that unemployment, or what Ms. Meelan's argument is that all the terms she's extending are independent of unemployment. What I'm telling you is that, that unemployment is not increased because of this, and if you extend her Tolley argument specifically says that unemployment is the biggest cause of poverty. So what I'm telling you is that even if
and it goes away because she's just not comparing to all of the different empirical warrants that I'm giving you for why poverty is not affected in the real, or why poverty is not affected in the real world. This means you affirm because I'm the one solving the income inequality gap. I'm giving people the ability to participate in democracy. That's you affirm.